The gymnasium buzzed with restless chatter. Hundreds of middle school students packed the worn-out bleachers, shifting in their seats as the principal tapped the microphone. But Naomi Sanders sat still, her hands tucked between her knees. The fabric of her faded, oversized sweater bunched at her wrists. Her shoes were scuffed, her backpack torn at the seams. She felt the weight of being invisible, and yet somehow also constantly seen for the wrong reasons. At the podium, Ms. Cartwright, the language arts teacher, adjusted her glasses and scanned the crowd. "There are some very bright students in this school," she began, her voice cutting through the low murmurs. "Students who will go far, but let's be honest, some won't. Some don't try hard enough. Some just don't have it." Naomi felt her stomach knot as Ms. Cartwright's gaze landed directly on her. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't imagined. It was aimed, like a judgmental spotlight. A few kids snickered behind their hands. One boy in Naomi's row turned to whisper something that made his friend choke on a laugh. Naomi stared down at her hands, pretending not to care, but the lump in her throat betrayed her. When the assembly ended, Naomi lingered in the hallway, waiting near the faculty lounge until she saw Ms. Cartwright pass. Her chest was tight, her heart pounded, but she stepped forward anyway. "I heard what you said," she said, voice steady despite the burn in her eyes. Ms. Cartwright barely paused. She looked Naomi over, her lips pressed into a thin, knowing smile. "You should focus on more realistic goals, Naomi. Not everyone is meant to shine." She walked off without waiting for a reply. Naomi stood frozen, her face burning. She turned sharply and fled to the nearest bathroom. Inside, she locked herself in a stall, leaned against the cool metal, and let the tears fall silently. She didn't cry out loud. She never did, but her whole body trembled, as if something inside her had cracked. Minutes later, she emerged and walked slowly to the sink. Her reflection looked small and sad. She wiped her eyes, smoothed her hair, and leaned in close to the mirror. "I'll prove you wrong," she whispered, voice barely audible. Then, a little louder, "One day you'll remember my name." The gymnasium buzzed with restless chatter. Hundreds of middle school students packed the worn-out bleachers, shifting in their seats as the principal tapped the microphone. But Naomi Sanders sat still, her hands tucked between her knees. The fabric of her faded, oversized sweater bunched at her wrists. Her shoes were scuffed, her backpack torn at the seams. She felt the weight of being invisible, and yet somehow also constantly seen for the wrong reasons. At the podium, Miss Cartwright, the language arts teacher, adjusted her glasses and scanned the crowd. "There are some very bright students in this school," she began, her voice cutting through the low murmurs. "Students who will go far, but let's be honest, some won't. Some don't try hard enough. Some just don't have it." Naomi felt her stomach knot as Miss Cartwright's gaze landed directly on her. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't imagined. It was aimed, like a judgmental spotlight. A few kids snickered behind their hands. One boy in Naomi's row turned to whisper something that made his friend choke on a laugh. Naomi stared down at her hands, pretending not to care, but the lump in her throat betrayed her. When the assembly ended, Naomi lingered in the hallway, waiting near the faculty lounge until she saw Ms. Cartwright pass. Her chest was tight, her heart pounded, but she stepped forward anyway. "I heard what you said," she said, voice steady despite the burn in her eyes. Miss Cartwright barely paused. She looked Naomi over, her lips pressed into a thin, knowing smile. "You should focus on more realistic goals, Naomi. Not everyone is meant to shine." She walked off without waiting for a reply. Naomi stood frozen, her face burning. She turned sharply and fled to the nearest bathroom. Inside, she locked herself in a stall, leaned against the cool metal, and let the tears fall silently. She didn't cry out loud. She never did, but her whole body trembled, as if something inside her had cracked. Minutes later, she emerged and walked slowly to the sink. Her reflection looked small and sad. She wiped her eyes, smoothed her hair, and leaned in close to the mirror. "I'll prove you wrong," she whispered, voice barely audible. Then, a little louder, "One day, you'll remember my name." Naomi stared at the cursor blinking inside the reply email box. Her fingers hovered above the keys, unmoving. 1,000 thoughts swirled inside her chest like a rising storm. She could just delete it. She didn't owe anyone anything, least of all a school that had watched her shrink and struggle without ever offering a hand. Her mouse moved toward the trash icon, but she didn't click. Instead, she opened her phone and called the one person who knew her better than anyone. Lena picked up on the second ring. "You finally remembered you have friends," she teased. "I got an email," Naomi said, voice low. "Oh? From a Nigerian prince or an ex?" Lena joked, then paused. "Wait, what's wrong?" Naomi exhaled. "It's from Crestwood." There was a beat of silence on the line. "What do they want?" "They're having a big anniversary. Want me to come back as guest of honor." Lena didn't answer immediately. You're joking, right?" Apparently, the school board voted. They want me to give a speech, sit on stage, be a model of success. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Ironic, right?" Lena's voice softened. "So what are you going to do?" "I'm not going," Naomi said quickly. "It's not worth dredging all that up. I haven't even set foot in that town in 10 years. And what if Ms. Cartwright is still there? Or some of the kids who—" "Naomi," she stopped. "You won't go for them. You'll go for you, for the girl who sat in the last row and still dared to dream." Lena's voice grew firmer. "This isn't about revenge. It's about finally being seen on your terms." Naomi blinked away sudden tears. "I don't want to feel small again." "You won't," Lena said, "because you're not that girl anymore." Later that night, Naomi stood in her closet, pulling out a small storage box she hadn't touched in years. She'd meant to find an old photo album to take with her, but instead, her fingers brushed over something softer, her mother's journal. She hadn't opened it in months. She sat cross-legged on the carpet, flipping through the pages until she found a dated entry, one written when Naomi was just 14. "Naomi will be someone someday. I just hope the world doesn't kill her spirit before she gets the chance to show it." Naomi's throat tightened. She could still see her mother, Gloria, walking through the door at dawn, exhaustion in her eyes, hands red from bleach and scrubbing, yet always, somehow, smiling at her daughter like Naomi was the best thing she'd ever made. Her fingers trembled as she closed the journal. It was time to step back into the place that had once dimmed her light and shine anyway. The next morning, she typed her reply. "Dear Principal Mason, thank you for your kind invitation. I'd be honored to attend." She hit send. Then, after a long pause, she opened another file on her computer, one she'd quietly been working on for months. A scholarship fund. She had never intended to tie it to her past, but maybe now was the right time. She renamed the file, the Gloria Sanders Resilience Award. One student, every year. A full scholarship for books, supplies, and mentorship. For any Crestwood student overlooked or underestimated, just like she had been. She didn't tell anyone, not even Lena. Let them think she was just coming to speak. Let them wait. The real gift, the real moment, was still to come. The train pulled into Crestwood just after noon. Naomi stepped onto the platform with a quiet breath, the kind that carried both weight and memory. The air smelled faintly of rust and damp pine. 10 years had passed, but the town hadn't changed much. The streets were still narrow. The diner on the corner still had the same flickering open sign. She caught a cab and asked the driver to take her past Oak Ridge Lane, her old neighborhood. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "You from around here?" "I was," Naomi replied, offering a faint smile. They slowed near the end of the street. Her childhood home stood there, weathered and worn. The paint had peeled. A shutter hung loose. The porch was sagging. The yard had long given up on grass. It looked hollow. She stepped out and approached the gate, letting her fingers trail along the rusty metal. The front window still had the old curtain pattern her mother had sewn. She didn't go inside. She didn't need to. Just seeing it from the sidewalk was enough. She whispered, "Hi, Mom," and turned away before her voice could crack. Later that afternoon, she walked into Crestwood's only coffee shop. It was filled with vaguely familiar faces. 2 women seated by the window did a double take. One whispered, "Is that Naomi Sanders?" She heard them, and she didn't mind. Some people smiled and came up to her, former classmates she barely remembered. James Kelly, now managing his father's auto shop, nodded respectfully. Mariah Deans, once the queen bee of 8th grade, worked as a nurse nearby. Her smile was genuine but awkward. "You look wow," Mariah said. "You too," Naomi replied politely. She left soon after. Too many ghosts. Too many layers. She stopped by Crestwood High, where Mr. Ruiz now taught. He greeted her like family, arms wide open. "Naomi Sanders, the one who made me believe teaching was worth it." Naomi laughed and hugged him tightly. You were the only one who ever saw me. They sat in his classroom, sunlight streaming in through the blinds. She's still here, you know, he said quietly, tapping his pen. Ms. Cartwright. Naomi froze. She hasn't changed much, he added. Still stuck in her ways, still pretending to inspire, when really, she just intimidates. Naomi said nothing, just nodded once, tightly. The next day, she walked through the familiar hallways of Crestwood Middle School. The lockers were still dented. The walls were still that same pale institutional green. Every step felt like peeling back a layer of herself she thought she'd outgrown. Her footsteps echoed, a rhythm of childhood anxiety and adult clarity colliding. Then came the staff lounge. She stepped in quietly. Ms. Cartwright sat at the far end, stirring her tea, scrolling through her phone. Her hair was shorter now, greyer at the temples. She didn't look up. Excuse me, Naomi said, her voice composed. Miss Cartwright looked up lazily, her eyes scanning Naomi with mild disinterest. Yes? Naomi took one step closer. Naomi Sanders. A beat. You once told me I'd never succeed. The silence that followed was sharp. Miss Cartwright furrowed her brow, then gave a small, indifferent chuckle. I told a lot of students that. It was never personal. Naomi's eyes didn't move. It was to me. For a moment, the older woman said nothing. Then she waved a hand dismissively. Well, clearly you proved me wrong. That's what matters, isn't it? Naomi didn't answer. She simply nodded once and walked out. The hallway seemed colder now. That night, back at her hotel, Naomi stared at her reflection. For the first time in years, she didn't feel powerful. She felt like that 13-year-old again. Small, dismissed, bruised by the very person who never deserved to have that power. She called Lena. I don't think I can do it, she said, lying on the bed, arm draped over her eyes. Being back here, it's like the ground underneath me remembers too much. You're not here for her, Naomi, Lena said firmly. You came back for the girl you used to be, the one who sat in that auditorium, the one who whispered to herself that she'd prove them wrong. Naomi's throat tightened. You're not here to impress Ms. Cartwright, Lena continued. You're here to remind yourself you were always worthy, and to show that girl in the mirror that she made it. Naomi didn't respond for a long moment. Then she sat up. I've written the speech, she said quietly. I finished it 2 weeks ago. Lena smiled through the phone. Then let them hear it. There was steel now in Naomi's voice. They will. The auditorium pulsed with low murmurs and shuffling programs. Rows of students sat in pressed uniforms. Parents held up phones. Teachers lined the aisles, whispering about how much they'd heard about the girl who made it big. A banner stretched across the stage. Crestwood Middle School, 75th anniversary celebration. Naomi stood backstage, her hands clasped tightly, a folded piece of paper in one hand, her mother's journal page in the other. Her name was called. She stepped into the spotlight. Applause rose like a tide. Behind her, a screen lit up, first with her current photo, elegant in a navy blue suit. Then it flickered to a school picture from 8th grade, Naomi at 13. Awkward, thin, eyes uncertain. The applause died down. She stepped to the mic. Good afternoon, Naomi began, her voice calm but resonant. My name is Naomi Sanders. 10 years ago, I sat in this very room. Her eyes scanned the audience. 10 years ago, someone in this very room told me I wouldn't succeed. The room held its breath. I carried that shame for years. It clung to me in college, at job interviews, during nights when I cried from exhaustion. But I also turned it into fire. A hush fell deeper. I was raised by a single mother, Gloria Sanders, who worked night shifts cleaning offices. She taught me to keep my head high, even when my heart was breaking. Naomi's voice cracked slightly. She didn't get to see this day, but she is here with me, every step of the way. She took a deep breath. I wasn't a star student. I wasn't popular. I was quiet, poor, and constantly told I wasn't enough, but I found my light anyway. Images of her non-profits work flashed behind her. Kids in reading programs, library builds, mentoring circles. My non-profit now serves over 50,000 children across the country. We build what we were never given, hope. She paused, then looked out at the rows of students, locking eyes with a girl in the front row who looked just like she had back then. Small, unsure, but still listening. And today, Naomi continued, her voice strengthening, I'm launching the Gloria Sanders Scholarship Fund for overlooked students in this district, for the dreamers who sit quietly and wonder if they matter. Her voice lifted, so that no child is ever told they don't deserve to shine." The room exploded. Applause thundered. Students stood up, clapping wildly. Teachers exchanged glances, some emotional, some sheepish. Reporters scribbled notes. Cameras flashed. Naomi stepped back from the mic, hands shaking, heart full. In the third row, Ms. Cartwright sat stiffly, lips pressed into a thin line. Her hands clutched her program tightly, knuckles white. She didn't clap. After the ceremony, Naomi was swarmed with well-wishers, reporters, students asking for photos. One even said, "You're the reason I want to write books." But as the crowd thinned, an administrative assistant quietly approached her. "There's something you should see," the woman said, handing Naomi a printed nomination form. It was a submission for Educator of the Year. Name: Evelyn Cartwright. Justification: Ms. Cartwright mentored Naomi Sanders, our distinguished alumna and guest of honor. Her commitment to student development is evident in Naomi's success story. Naomi read it twice. Her chest went cold. Later that evening, in her hotel room, she sat at the desk and opened her laptop. She pulled up the email for the district board and typed slowly, deliberately, "Dear Crestwood Selection Committee, I am honored to have been invited to speak at your celebration. I am grateful to the teachers who saw me, who challenged me with kindness and belief, particularly Mr. Ruiz, whose impact on my life is immeasurable. However, I must respectfully clarify, I did not succeed because of Ms. Cartwright. I succeeded despite her. She did not mentor me. She diminished me. And though I hold no anger, I cannot allow my name to be used in a way that distorts that truth." Naomi Sanders. She read it over once. Then she hit send. It wasn't about punishment. It was about setting the record straight. She closed her laptop and looked out the window. The town lights flickered below, but the sky above was clear. And Naomi, for the first time in years, felt completely light. The next morning, the sky was overcast, the kind Naomi always associated with quiet reflection. Naomi walked slowly through the cemetery, heels crunching softly on the gravel path. In her hands, she held a bouquet of white lilies, her mother's favorite. She stopped at a modest gravestone under a willow tree, worn but lovingly kept. The inscription read, "Gloria Sanders. She believed in me when no one else did." Naomi knelt and placed the flowers gently at the base. For a long moment she said nothing, just breathed. Then, softly, "You were right, Mama. I made it." Her voice cracked. A breeze lifted her curls as if in response. "I used to think proving them wrong was the goal," she continued. "But standing on that stage yesterday, it wasn't about them. It was about you, and me, and the kids like us who never got to believe they could." She traced the letters of her mother's name with her fingers. "You gave me everything you had, and I promise I'll keep giving it forward." Naomi stood, brushed off her skirt, and walked away with a calm in her chest she hadn't felt in years. That afternoon, Naomi stopped by a quiet neighborhood home. She rang the bell, and Mr. Ruiz opened the door. His eyes widened in surprise before filling with joy. "Naomi," he whispered, voice cracking. "You came." She smiled. "I owed you a thank you." They sat in the living room over tea, and she told him how much his encouragement had meant, how it was his handwritten comments in the margins of her stories that made her believe she had a voice worth using. He blinked rapidly, swallowing emotion. "I always knew you'd do something powerful. I just hoped someone out there would see it too." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "You were the first person who ever did." Later, Naomi visited her old middle school library. The school had invited her to speak briefly to a few students before she left town. As she wrapped up a short Q&A, a girl lingered behind, small, brown-skinned, with round glasses and quiet eyes. Naomi approached her gently. "Hey," the girl fiddled with the hem of her shirt. "My name's Kayla. Everyone says I'm too quiet to be a leader. I don't really speak in class." Naomi smiled. "You remind me of someone I used to know." She reached into her bag and pulled out a book, Women Who Changed the World, and slipped her business card inside. "You know what I've learned?" Naomi said as she handed it to her. "Quiet girls make the loudest difference. They just do it in their own time." Kayla looked up, eyes wide. "Thank you." Naomi crouched to her level, gently fixing a curl behind Kayla's ear. "Don't let the noise of others tell you who you are," she whispered. "You're already someone." As she left the building, Naomi looked back once and saw Kayla seated in a corner, already flipping through the book. Something in Naomi settled. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the part where she passed the torch. The hum of the plane was soft, almost meditative. Naomi sat by the window, her coat folded neatly over her lap, the clouds drifting far below. She opened her phone, idly checking her notifications, and froze. Her speech, a video taken by a student, had gone viral. Millions of views, thousands of shares, comments scrolling endlessly. She scrolled slowly, absorbing the words. I showed this to my daughter. She cried. Thank you. My teacher said the same thing to me. Thank you for standing up for all of us. You just gave me the courage to apply to college. Naomi's fingers hovered over the screen. She hadn't planned on going viral. She hadn't planned on anything beyond healing. But now her words had become something bigger. She turned the screen off, cradled it in her hands, and leaned her head against the window. Outside, the sun was just beginning to set, streaks of gold against deepening blue. A quiet smile touched her lips. For years, she'd carried that wound, buried it, dressed it in success, hid it behind achievements. But now it wasn't a wound anymore. It was something else. A story, a spark, a light for others. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth rise from her chest. Then, softly, almost inaudibly, she whispered to herself, now the world knows my name. Hi besties, thank you so much for watching to the end. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe.